The Port of Boston in 1999 was its own country, a sovereign nation of steel, salt, and sweat, governed by codes older than the city itself. It was a world of early mornings shrouded in fog, so thick it could swallow the sound of the ship's horn, and late nights under the jaundiced glow of sodium lamps. Here, a man's word was his bond, and loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered. At the heart of this kingdom, ruling not from a throne, but from the worn-out chair of a cluttered office that smelled of stale coffee and sea air, was Frank. Oh, single quotes, Mally Frank was the president of the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 259. He was a titan, a man built like the dock pilings he'd once helped drive into the sea, but broad, solid, and unyielding. His voice, roughened by years of shouting over the din of cranes and engines, could command the attention of 1,000 men with a single word. But it was the heart behind the voice that earned him their devotion. Frank had fought for them, bled. For them, he'd walked picket lines in the biting winter wind and negotiated contracts in stifling boardrooms, always emerging with better wages, safer conditions, and the kind of pension that meant a man could retire with dignity. He wasn't just their president, he was their champion. His daughter, Erin, saw him as something simpler and far grander, her hero. At 18, she was on the cusp of leaving for Boston College, armed with a scholarship and her father's fierce pride. She had his bright blue eyes, but her mother's gentle smile. She loved the harbor not for its grit, but for what it represented, the community her father had built, the families he had protected. She'd spent countless Saturdays in his office, doing her homework while he mediated disputes, his voice, a low, reasonable rumble that could soothe the most heated tempers. Frank's world, and therefore Erin's, was built on trust. And the man he trusted most was Vinny the Weasel Gallo. The nickname was an old joke, a relic from their childhood days, but it had lost its playful edge over the years. Vinny was Frank's right-hand man, his consigliere, the keeper of the books. Where Frank was a bulwark, Vinny was a current quick, clever, and able to navigate the treacherous channels of finance and politics that Frank found so tiresome. Frank trusted him with the union's pension fund, a sacred treasure chest holding the futures of thousands of men. It was a trust Frank would have staked his life on. He had no idea Vinny had already sold it. Vinny's betrayal wasn't born of a single moment of malice, but cultivated over years of quiet desperation. He had a hunger for a life beyond the docks, a life of silk suits, high-stakes poker games and smoky backrooms, and the easy respect that came with throwing money around. This hunger became an addiction, and addictions demand to be fed. His debts to a local crime syndicate had grown from a nuisance to a threat, a tightening noose around his neck. The shipping magnates, powerful men who saw Local 259 as a thorn in their side, smelled his desperation. They offered him a way out, a fortune in an offshore account in exchange for one thing: the destruction of Frank O'Malley and the weakening of his union. The plan was as insidious as it was brilliant. Over 80 months, Vinny orchestrated a series of phantom transactions, a complex web of shell corporations and falsified invoices. He siphoned $10 million from the pension fund, meticulously crafting a digital and paper trail that led not to him but directly to the office of Frank O'Malley. He forged Frank's signature, mimicked his investment patterns, and planted fabricated emails. He was setting the stage for a public execution. The day it happened was a crisp autumn Tuesday. A general union meeting had been called. The vast warehouse was packed, the air thick with the smell of diesel and camaraderie. Frank was on the dais, outlining the details of a new jurisdictional agreement, his voice resonating with confidence. Erin sat in the front row, home for a long weekend. Beaming with pride, then the great metal doors of the warehouse slid open with a deafening screech. Sunlight streamed in, silhouetting a dozen figures in dark suits. FBI. The word rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Two agents walked directly to the stage, their faces grim and impassive. Frank O'Malley? One of them said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Frank, confused but not yet alarmed, nodded. I'm Frank O'Malley. What's this about? You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. The collective gasp of 1,000 men sucked the air from the room. Erin felt her heart stop. She saw Vinny standing near the side of the stage, his face a perfect mask of shock and concern, a masterful performance. He even rushed forward, shouting, "This is a mistake. You've got the wrong man." But the agents were unswayed. They turned Frank around and handcuffed him. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. It was the sound of a world ending. As they led him away, Frank's eyes scanned the crowd, bewildered, until they found Erin's. In them, she saw not guilt, but a profound, shattering confusion. He was a king being dethroned in his own castle, and he didn't even know who the assassins were. The trial was a massacre. The prosecution, armed with Vinny's meticulously fabricated evidence, painted Frank as a hypocrite and a thief. They presented bank statements, forged signatures, and expert testimony that twisted Frank's every legitimate action into a piece of a criminal puzzle. Frank's defense was simple, his word. He stood on the stand and declared his innocence. But in a court of law, his word was worth nothing against a mountain of false documents. Vinny Gallo delivered the final killing blow. He took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, his voice choked with false emotion as he described his heartbreak at discovering his mentor's betrayal. He was utterly convincing. The jury was out for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The verdict didn't just break Frank O'Malley. It shattered the community he had built. The media crucified him. The family name became a curse. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Frank's wife, Eleanor, a woman whose spirit was as bright as her smile, withered under the weight of the shame and sorrow. Her heart, already weak, gave out 6 months after the sentencing. At 18, Erin O'Malley buried her mother and lost her father to a concrete box hundreds of miles away. She was left alone in a world that had turned on her, with nothing but the tarnished legacy of a fallen hero and a cold, burning certainty in her heart. Her father was innocent. And as she stood over her mother's grave, the Boston skyline, a hazy silhouette in the distance, she made a silent promise. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would find the truth. She would uncover the real traitors. And she would reclaim the honor of the O'Malley name. The harbor had been betrayed, but the longshoreman's daughter would one day make it right. Her war had just begun. The 20 years that followed were a long, slow grind, a crucible that burned away the last vestiges of the girl Erin O'Malley had been and forged the woman she had to become. The promise she made at her mother's grave was not a shout of defiance, but a low, steady flame she tended in the deepest part of her soul. It was her only source of warmth in a world that had grown cold and hostile. She abandoned her plans for Boston College. The scholarship felt like blood money, and the world of academia seemed frivolous and distant compared to the raw, immediate reality of her mission. She needed to understand the world that had destroyed her father, not from a classroom, but from the inside out, so she did the one thing no one expected. She walked into the Union Hall, her chin held high against the stairs and whispers, and applied for a job on the docks. The first few years were a special kind of hell. She was a woman in a man's world, and worse, she was an O'Malley. To many, her presence was an insult, a constant reminder of the great betrayal. They gave her the worst jobs, cleaning the grimy break rooms, chipping rust off old equipment in the blistering sun, working the night shift in the dead of winter when the wind off the Atlantic felt like a physical blow. Men who had once bounced her on their knee now looked through her as if she were a ghost. The younger workers who only knew the legend of the thieving president mocked her openly. Her hands, once destined for lecture notes and textbooks, became calloused and scarred. Her body ached with a fatigue so profound it settled in her bones. More than once, she almost broke. There were nights she would come home to her small, empty apartment, the one she could barely afford, and collapse onto her bed, too tired to even cry. In those moments of despair, she would pull out the letters from her father. His early letters from prison were filled with a bewildered rage, a desperate attempt to make sense of the injustice. But over time, they softened, filled instead with concern for her, with memories of her mother, and with a quiet, unshakable dignity. He never stopped proclaiming his innocence, not in a loud, demanding way, but with the simple, stubborn faith of a man who knew his own heart. Don't let them make you bitter, Erin, he wrote in one letter. Hate is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. You just hold on to the truth. The truth has a weight of its own. His words became her anchor. She learned to weather the scorn, to meet insults with a stony silence. She focused on the work. She learned the intricate dance of the cranes, the language of the ship manifests, the unique rhythm of the port. She learned to tie knots that could hold 1,000 tons and to spot a weak weld on a container from 50 yards away. She didn't ask for respect. She earned it inch by painful inch. The turning point came one brutal February afternoon. A storm had rolled in unexpectedly, and a crane operator, rushing to unload a series of containers, misjudged the wind. A massive steel box, weighing tons, swung wildly, its tethering cables groaning under the strain. It was heading directly for a group of men, including a young longshoreman who had been one of Erin's most vocal tormentors. Panic seized the dock. Men scattered, shouting warnings. But Erin, who had been tracking the crane's movements, saw the only way out. She sprinted towards a winch control panel, her mind a blur of angles and physics. She slammed her hand on the emergency release for a secondary support cable, a risky move that could have made things worse. For a heart-stopping second, the container plunged, then jerked to a halt, swinging harmlessly into an empty section of the pier. Inches from disaster. Silence fell. The young longshoreman she had saved stared at her, his face pale with shock and a dawning, grudging respect. From that day on, the mockery stopped. The whispers didn't vanish, but they changed in tone. They were no longer about the trader's daughter, but about the woman who had the guts and the skill of a seasoned veteran. Slowly, the old guard began to open up. Old man, Fitz, a wiry, white-haired foreman who had been her father's closest friend, was the first. He started leaving a hot coffee for her on cold mornings. Then came quiet conversations, away from the prying eyes of Vinnie Gallo's loyalists. Fitz would tell her stories about her father, filling in the gaps of her memory, reminding her of the man he truly was. Your father, Fitz told her one evening, his voice a low rasp. He had a rule. Never make a promise you can't keep, and never break a promise you make. Vinnie was all promises, smooth as silk, that one. Through Fitz, she connected with others' pops, a retired mechanic. Maria, a clerk in the records office who despised Vinnie. They became her secret network, her eyes and ears. They were too afraid to act openly, for Vinnie now ruled the union with an iron fist, rewarding loyalty and ruthlessly crushing dissent. But they could listen. They could remember. They fed her scraps of information. A strange meeting Vinnie took. A company that got a contract it didn't deserve. A name whispered in a hallway. Each scrap was a piece of a puzzle she didn't yet know how to assemble. She lived a Spartan life. saving every dollar she could. Her small apartment became her war room. The walls were covered in charts, timelines, and photographs of the key players. At night, after a grueling 10-hour shift, she would sit under a single bare bulb, poring over old court documents, financial reports she'd gotten through Maria, and news articles. She taught herself forensic accounting, tracing the flow of money, learning the language of shell corporations and offshore accounts. It was a slow, agonizing process, like trying to map the ocean with a teaspoon. The years bled into one another. Her 20s faded into her 30s. She watched friends get married, have children, build lives. Her own life was on hold, a long, patient vigil. Her singular focus was both her strength and her curse. It gave her purpose, but it isolated her, carving a space between her and the rest of the world that few could cross. When her father was finally released after serving his full sentence, he was a ghost of the man he had been. 15 years in a federal prison had stooped his broad shoulders and drained the fire from his eyes. He was quiet, withdrawn, and moved into Erin's small apartment without complaint. He rarely spoke of his time inside, but Erin could see the damage it had done. Yet, when he looked at her, at the powerful, determined woman she had become, a flicker of the old Frank would return. "You've been carrying this all on your own, haven't you?" he said one night, his voice thick with emotion. "We carry it together." "Dad," she replied, her hand covering his return, however, was the catalyst she needed. His presence was a constant, living reminder of the debt that was still owed. And her network, seeing the injustice embodied in the broken man before them, became bolder. The scraps of information became more substantial. A name surfaced, a disgraced accountant named Arthur Finch, who had been fired by Vinny years ago, under mysterious circumstances, and had since disappeared. Finding Arthur Finch became Erin's new obsession. It felt different. It felt like the first solid thread she could pull. The promise she had made as a girl had been forged in grief and anger. But now, after 20 years of toil, patience, and sacrifice, it had been tempered into something harder, sharper, and far more dangerous: a plan. The longshoreman's daughter was done waiting. She was ready to start collecting. The name Arthur Finch was more than a lead. It was a spark in the suffocating darkness of 2 decades. To Erin, it felt like the first sign of a changing tide. But finding a man who desperately wanted to stay hidden was a challenge of a different order. Finch had not simply been fired. He had been professionally and personally obliterated by Vinnie Gallo, erased from the world of finance as thoroughly as a chalk drawing in a downpour. There was no digital footprint, no forwarding address, no trace. He was a ghost. Erin began her search in the only way she knew how, with relentless, methodical patience. She spent her nights digging through arcane public records, cross-referencing old property deeds, tax liens, and voter registrations. She used the union's own archives with the help of Maria, the records clerk, to pull every document that bore Finch's name, looking for any connection, any associate who might still be in contact. It was like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach dot. Her breakthrough came not from a computer, but from the memory of a human being. Pops, the retired mechanic and one of her father's staunchest old friends, remembered something. Finch, Arthur Finch, he'd mumbled one afternoon over coffee at his kitchen table. Skinny fella, sweated a lot. Always looked like a rabbit who'd just seen a fox. I remember he was crazy about fishing. Used to talk about getting a little cabin up on Lake Winnipesaukee. Said the only place you could find any peace was on the water. It was a sliver of a chance, but it was more than she'd had in months. New Hampshire, Lake Winnipesaukee. Erin took a week off from the docks, a rare vacation she told everyone was for some much-needed rest. She drove north, the gritty Boston. skyline shrinking in her rearview mirror, replaced by the dense green forests of New England. The air itself seemed to change, losing its salty, industrial edge and taking on the clean scent of pine and damp earth. Lake Winnipesaukee was vast, its shoreline dotted with hundreds of small towns, marinas, and secluded cabins. For 3 days, she drove the winding roads, stopping at every town hall, every bait and tackle shop, every local diner. She showed them an old photo of Finch, a grainy image from a 20-year-old union newsletter. Most people just shook their heads. But in a dusty tax assessor's office in the small town of Wolfeboro, a clerk with a sharp memory peered at the photo. "Looks a bit like Artie," she said, tapping a finger on the counter. "Artie Peterson. Lives out on the old Miller Road, keeps to himself, pays his taxes in cash, right on time every year." He had changed his name. Of course he had. The cabin on Miller Road was more of a shack, weathered and gray, almost swallowed by the overgrown woods surrounding it. A battered pickup truck sat resting in the driveway. As Erin approached, a figure emerged from the cabin. It was him. He was older, thinner, his hair almost completely white, but the nervous, hunted look in his eyes was unmistakable. It was Arthur. Finch. When he saw Erin, a wave of pure panic washed over his face. He darted back towards the door, fumbling for the lock. "Mr. Finch." Erin called out, holding up her hands to show she was unarmed. "My name is Erin O'Malley. I just want to talk." The name O'Malley stopped him cold. He turned, his face pale. "I have nothing to say to you," he stammered. "Leave me alone." "Vinnie Gallo destroyed my father's life based on lies," Erin said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the quiet woods. "I think you know that. I think you know exactly what he did because he used you to help do it. And then he threw you away like a piece of trash." Finch flinched as if she'd struck him. For 20 years, he had lived in a self-imposed prison of fear and shame, haunted by his complicity. He had been a competent, if timid, accountant. When Vinnie had first approached him with the scheme, Finch had refused. But Vinnie had a lever. He knew about a costly mistake Finch had made years earlier, an error he had covered up. Vinnie threatened to expose him, to ruin him. Terrified, Finch had complied, helping to create the false paper trail that would send Frank O'Malley to prison. Afterwards, riddled with guilt and terrified of both Vinnie and the law, he had simply vanished. "You don't know anything," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I know Vinnie is about to sign a new contract that will gut the pensions of every man and woman on those docks." Erin pressed on. "The same men whose futures you helped him steal 20 years ago. This is your one chance, Mr. Finch. Your one chance to make it right, to stop being a ghost and be a man again." She spent the next 2 hours on his porch, not threatening, not cajoling, but simply telling him her story. She told him about her mother's death, her father's years in prison, her own struggle on the docks. She spoke of the honor and dignity that had been stolen from her family. She wasn't just asking for his help. She was showing him the human cost of his silence. Slowly, painstakingly, the dam of his fear began to crack. He invited her inside. The cabin was neat but sparse, the home of a man who expected nothing and owned even less. He made coffee, his hands shaking, and then he began to talk. He told her everything. He explained the mechanics of the fraud, the specific accounts used, the way Vinnie had mimicked Frank's investment style. But then he revealed the final, crucial piece, the smoking gun. Before he fled, in a fit of either self-preservation or a flicker of conscience, Finch had made a backup of the original. Unaltered server data, the data from before Vinnie's manipulations. He had stored it on a set of old zip disks, an obsolete technology he was sure no one would ever think to look for. And he had kept something else, a small, handheld cassette recorder, on which he had secretly taped his final explosive meeting with Vinny, where Vinny had gloated about the plan and threatened Finch to ensure his silence. I was so scared, Finch confessed, his voice breaking. I buried them in a waterproof box right out by the old oak tree. Together they went out into the damp evening air. With a shovel, Finch dug into the soft earth. He pulled out a small sealed metal box. Inside, nestled in yellowed foam, were 3 zip discs and a microcassette tape. It was the truth, preserved in amber dot as Erin drove back to Boston that night. The box sitting on the passenger seat like a holy relic, she felt a profound shift. The fight was no longer a matter of faith and scraps of information. It was now a matter of timing and execution. She had the weapon. Back in Boston, the tension on the docks was palpable. The vote on the new contract was a week away. Vinny Gallo, arrogant and secure in his power, was promising a small, insignificant signing bonus to distract from the catastrophic cuts to pensions and health care. The men were angry but felt powerless, trapped by the man who held their futures. In his hands, Erin knew this was her moment. She met with Old Man Fitz and Pops, laying out the final pieces of her plan. She worked with a tech-savvy nephew of Maria's to retrieve the data from the ancient zip disks. Converting it into a clear, damning presentation, she had the tape digitized. The trap was set. The promise she had made to her father was no longer just a whisper in her heart. It was a roar, waiting to be unleashed. For 20 years, she had been a ship sailing through a fog of uncertainty. Now, the fog was lifting, and the harbor was in sight, and she was steering a warship. The Union Hall, a cavernous warehouse that usually smelled of cold steel and hard work, was suffocating. On the day of the contract vote, it was packed with over 1,000 longshoremen, their bodies crammed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with the scent of sweat, anxiety, and stale coffee. The mood was sullen, a mix of resignation and simmering rage. They felt the betrayal of the proposed contract in their bones, that 20 years under Vinny Gallo's thumb had taught them the futility of resistance. He was a king in his castle, and they were merely his subjects. Vinny stood on the makeshift stage, bathed in the harsh glare of portable floodlights. He was in his element, a master of manipulation. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place against the backdrop of corrugated metal walls, a symbol of the chasm that now separated him from the men he claimed to represent. His voice, amplified by the crackling PA system, was smooth and paternalistic, dripping with false sincerity. "Brothers," he began, his arms spread wide. "I know this is a tough pill to swallow. No one wants to make concessions. But we're living in a new world. The shipping companies are playing hardball. This contract ensures our survival. It keeps this union strong. And I fought tooth and nail to get every one of you a $2,000 signing bonus." A few of his cronies, strategically placed in the crowd, started a half-hearted round of applause, but it died quickly, swallowed by a wave of discontented murmuring. They knew a bribe when they saw one. $2,000 was an insult, a cheap price for their future security. As Vinny wrapped up his speech. With more empty promises, a figure emerged from the center of the crowd and began walking towards the stage. It was Erin O'Malley. A hush fell over the warehouse. In 20 years, she had never once spoken at a union meeting. She was a worker, a presence, a quiet force, but never a voice. Now, her steady, determined stride commanded the attention of every man in the room. She wore her work clothes, steel-toed boots, fitted jeans, and a simple dark sweatshirt. She was one of them. She walked up the rickety wooden steps and stood on the stage. A few feet from Vinny, he stared at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, quickly replaced by a condescending smile. "Erin, my dear," he said into the microphone, "if you have something to say, please be brief. "We have a vote to conduct." Erin ignored him. She turned to face the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the sea of weathered, tired faces. She saw Old Man Fitz give her a slight, encouraging nod. She saw her father, Frank, standing quietly in the back, his presence giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice clear and strong, needing no microphone to carry its weight. "My name is Erin O'Malley," she began. "My father was Frank O'Malley, and for 20 years, most of you have believed he was a thief who stole from Miss Union, stole from you." The silence was absolute. "You've been told a lie," she continued, her voice rising with passion. "The man who stole from you is standing right here." She pointed a single, trembling finger at Vinnie Gallo. Vinnie laughed, a short, ugly bark. "This is pathetic, Erin. Grieving for your father after all these years. Security, get her off the stage," but no one moved. All eyes were locked on Erin. "You talk about sacrifice, Vinnie?" She called out, her voice ringing with contempt. "Let me show you what you sacrificed." That was the cue. In the back of the hall, Maria's nephew hit a key on a laptop. A projector flickered to life, casting a massive image onto the warehouse's white-painted brick wall. It was a bank statement from a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, showing a deposit of $5 million dated 1 week after her father's conviction. The crowd gasped. Erin's voice cut through the noise. That was Vinnie's first payment for selling out this union. But he didn't just sell your future. He had to frame a good man to do it. She clicked a small remote in her hand. The image on the wall changed, showing a side-by-side comparison. On one side was the union's pension fund ledger from before the fraud, retrieved from Arthur Finch's hidden disks. On the other was the doctored version used in court. The presentation, clear and simple, highlighted the specific transactions that had been fabricated. The digital forgeries, the path of the stolen money. It was an irrefutable visual confession. Vinnie's face had gone from smug to ashen. "This is garbage." "Forged documents?" He sputtered into the mic. "Is it, Vinnie?" Erin's voice was cold as ice. "Is this garbage too?" She held up a small digital audio player. 20 years ago, you threatened a man named Arthur Finch. You made him help you. And then you ruined his life to ensure his silence. But he kept a secret. He kept a recording. She pressed play. The scratchy, tinny voice of a younger Vinnie Gallo filled the vast space, amplified through the PA system. "Frank's a dinosaur, Artie. He doesn't get it. This is about the future. My future. You just keep your mouth shut, and you'll be fine. You breathe a word of this to anyone, and I'll bury you so deep your own family won't find the grave. Frank O'Malley is going down, and I'm going to be the one holding the shovel." The recording ended. For a moment, there was only the sound of the audio player's hiss. Then the silence was shattered. It wasn't a shout, but a low, guttural roar, a wave of pure, undiluted fury rising from 1,000 betrayed men. It was the sound of 20 years of suppressed anger, of quiet suffering, of gnawing injustice. Finally unleashed, the crowd surged forward, a human tsunami of rage. The men in the front row, their faces contorted with fury, started to climb the stage. Vinnie's cronies, terrified, melted back into the crowd. Vinnie himself was paralyzed, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Just as the first man reached the stage, the great metal doors of the warehouse slid open with the same screech they had 20 years before. But this time, the figures silhouetted against the light were not a source of fear, but of deliverance. The FBI, tipped off by Erin an hour earlier, swarmed into the hall. They moved with practiced efficiency, forming a barrier between the enraged crowd and the stage. 2 agents walked directly up to a stunned Vinnie Gallo. "Vincent Gallo," one of them said, his voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. As they pulled his arms, behind his back and the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut, a thunderous cheer erupted from the longshoremen. It was a cheer of vindication, of liberation. As Vinny was led away, his eyes met Frank O'Malley's for a brief, searing moment. In Frank's eyes, there was no triumph, only a deep, profound pity for the man who had once been his friend. Then the agents led Vinny past Erin. He looked at her, his face a mess of hatred and defeat. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression not one of victory, but of solemn finality. The harbor's wrath had finally come for him. The debt had been paid. In the weeks following Vinnie Gallo's arrest, a strange quiet settled over the port of Boston. It wasn't the silence of defeat that had lingered for 2 decades, but the calm, contemplative silence that follows a great storm. The fury had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was both shattered and cleansed. The legal machinery, now aimed in the right direction, moved with surprising speed. Faced with Arthur Finch's testimony and the irrefutable digital and audio evidence, Vinny's case was airtight. He confessed to everything in exchange for a lesser sentence, and his confession officially exonerated Frank O'Malley of all charges. The official announcement was a dry legal document, but for the O'Malley family and the men of Local 259, it was a proclamation of liberation. A small, informal ceremony was held on the docks. The union's lawyer read the court order, and with those few words, 20 years of shame were wiped away. Frank O'Malley stood before his men, not as the titan he once was, but as something more enduring, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can eventually find its way to the light. He didn't make a speech. He simply stood there, his eyes glistening, and nodded at the men who had finally welcomed him home. The real work, however, was just beginning. The union was in shambles. Its finances were a tangled mess of debt and fraudulent contracts, and its spirit was broken. It needed a leader, not just to manage its affairs, but to restore its soul. There was only one choice. In a special election, with a unanimity that was unprecedented in the union's history, Erin O'Malley was elected president of Local 259. The transition from longshoreman to president was jarring. She traded her steel-toed boots for sensible shoes, her work gloves for stacks of paperwork. The office that had once been her father's, and then Vinny's, felt alien to her. She had it cleared out completely, stripping it down to the bare walls before bringing in a simple desk and a few chairs. She wanted no ghosts, no remnants of the past. Her first months were a trial by fire. She worked 18-hour days, flanked by a team of forensic accountants and lawyers, untangling the web of deceit Vinny had woven. She renegotiated the disastrous contract, clawing back the pension benefits and healthcare provisions he had been ready to sign away. She faced down the same shipping magnates who had conspired with Vinny, but this time they were facing a different kind of O'Malley. She didn't have her father's booming voice or his backslapping charm. She had something more formidable, an encyclopedic knowledge of every line of every contract, a quiet, unshakable resolve, and the unwavering support of 1,000 longshoremen. Who would have walked through fire for her? She won. She secured a contract that was not just fair, but was one of the strongest the union had seen in years. One evening, exhausted after a particularly grueling negotiation, she found her father waiting for her in the now-clean office. He was looking out the window at the harbor lights twinkling on the water. "I used to stand here," he said softly, "and I'd feel like I was on top of the world. I felt responsible for all of this. It was a heavy weight." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a pride that was almost painful to behold. "That weight is on your shoulders now. But you're not carrying it alone, are you?" "No, Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not." "The promise." he said, his voice barely a whisper. You kept it. We kept it, she corrected him gently. That night, Erin knew her war was truly over. The quest for vengeance that had consumed her entire adult life had been fulfilled. For so long, her identity had been defined by that single purpose. Now, standing in the quiet of the office, she felt a strange and unfamiliar sensation: peace. The fire of retribution had been extinguished, and in its place was a warm, steady glow of responsibility and hope. Her inauguration as president was not a grand affair. It was held on the docks, under a clear blue sky, with the sounds of the working harbor as its orchestra. She stood on a simple platform, looking out at the faces of her Union brothers and sisters. She saw Fitz and Pops, their old eyes shining. With tears, she saw the young men who had once mocked her, now looking at her with something akin to awe. And she saw her father, standing tall, his honor restored, his smile serene. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried across the water. 20 years, this union was led by fear and lies, she said. We were taught to look out for ourselves, to distrust our brothers, to forget what this symbol, she pointed to the Union logo on the lectern, truly means. It means we are one. It means an injury to one is an injury to all. From this day forward, we will be led by trust. We will be led by transparency. We will be led by honor. She paused, her gaze sweeping over them all. The old tide has gone out, she declared. Today, a new one begins. As the crowd erupted in a roar of applause, Erin looked out towards the mouth of the harbor, where a massive container ship was making its way out to the open sea. The sun was high in the sky, glinting off the water, and for the first time in a very long time, the future looked as vast and as bright as the ocean itself. The longshoreman's daughter had come home, not just to reclaim a legacy, but to build a new one.